When your wife doesn't come home for 2 nights straight and you find yourself staring at her empty side of the bed, you realize that some silences scream louder than any argument ever could. It was a Thursday evening when Sarah walked out the door with her gym bag slung over her shoulder. She kissed me on the cheek, the same way she had for the past 8 years of our marriage, and said she'd be back by 9. The clock struck midnight, and her side of the bed remained cold and untouched. I told myself there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe her phone died. Maybe she stayed late at her sister's place. Maybe I'd wake up and she'd be there, brewing coffee like nothing happened. But Friday morning came, and the house felt different. Empty in a way that had nothing to do with silence. I called her phone 17 times. Each ring felt like a small death. I texted her friends, her coworkers, even her mother who lived 3 states away. Nobody had seen her. Nobody had heard from her. The gym she claimed to attend every Thursday evening? They said she hadn't been a member in over 6 months. That's when the foundation of everything I knew began to crack. I spent Friday searching. I drove to every place we'd ever been together, every coffee shop where she liked to read, every park where we'd walked hand in hand in better days. I called hospitals. I called the police, but they said 24 hours wasn't long enough to file a missing person report for an adult who left voluntarily. Voluntarily. That word burned in my chest like acid. Friday night, I sat alone in our living room, staring at our wedding photo on the mantel. We looked so happy then, so certain of forever. I wondered when forever had started feeling like a prison sentence neither of us wanted to serve. I opened her laptop, something I'd never done before. Trust, we'd always said, was the foundation of our marriage. But trust is a luxury you can't afford when your wife vanishes into thin air. Her email was open. I shouldn't have looked. Part of me wishes I hadn't. But I did, and that's when I found them. Messages stretching back 7 months. Conversations with someone named Marcus. They weren't explicit, not at first. Just friendly. Too friendly. Inside jokes I wasn't part of. Good morning texts that arrived before I even woke up. Plans to meet for lunch, then coffee, then dinner. I scrolled through months of my wife falling in love with someone else in real time, and I hadn't noticed a single thing. The messages from the last week were different. More urgent. He was asking her to make a choice. He said he'd gotten a job offer in Seattle and wanted her to come with him. He said he loved her, that he'd waited long enough, that she needed to decide what kind of life she wanted. Her last message to him was sent Thursday afternoon, 3 hours before she left with her gym bag. It simply said, "I'm ready." Saturday morning, she came home. I heard her key in the lock at 6 in the morning. I'd been awake all night, sitting in the dark living room, watching the door like a soldier in a foxhole. She walked in looking tired but composed, like she'd just returned from a business trip instead of abandoning her husband for 2 days without a word. She saw me sitting there and stopped. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was so heavy I could barely breathe through it. Then she opened her mouth to speak, and I held up my hand. I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want the excuses, the explanations, the carefully crafted stories she'd probably rehearsed on the drive home. I didn't want to hear about Marcus, or Seattle, or how she'd fallen out of love with me so gradually that she hadn't even noticed it happening until it was already done. I didn't want her apologies or her tears or her promises that it wasn't what it looked like, when we both knew exactly what it looked like. I'd spent 2 days drowning in confusion and fear and betrayal. I'd spent 2 nights imagining every worst-case scenario, from car accidents to abduction to murder. I'd called hospitals and police stations and morgues. I'd died 1,000 small deaths wondering if the woman I loved was lying in a ditch somewhere, hurt and alone and calling my name. And the truth was so much simpler and so much worse. She'd chosen to leave. She'd chosen him. She'd chosen a life that didn't include me, and the only reason she came back was because she wasn't brave enough to stay gone. I stood up from the couch and walked past her to our bedroom. I pulled out the suitcase from under the bed and started filling it with my clothes. She followed me, her voice rising with panic now, asking what I was doing, begging me to listen, to let her explain. But I'd already heard everything I needed to hear in her silence for the past 48 hours. You don't get to disappear from someone's life and then act surprised when they stop waiting for you to come back. I packed methodically, taking only what I needed. My clothes. My laptop. The watch my father gave me. The photograph of my parents that sat on my nightstand. I left everything else. The house we'd bought together, the furniture we'd chosen, the life we'd built. It all felt like it belonged to strangers now. Like I was walking through a museum of someone else's marriage. She was crying now, full sobs that shook her shoulders. She kept saying she was sorry, that she'd made a mistake, that she'd chosen me. But that was the problem, wasn't it? After 8 years of marriage, I'd become a choice instead of a certainty. I'd become an option she had to weigh against other possibilities, instead of the person she couldn't imagine living without. I walked out of that house with my suitcase in one hand and my dignity in the other. I didn't slam the door. I didn't yell. I didn't give her the dramatic exit scene she might have expected. I just left, the same way she had, except I had the decency to do it while she was watching. That was 6 months ago. I'm living in a small apartment across town now. It's quiet. Peaceful. Mine. I've started running in the mornings, something I never had time for when I was trying to save a marriage that was already dead. I've reconnected with old friends I'd lost touch with. I've remembered what it feels like to be myself instead of half of a failing partnership. Sarah calls sometimes. I don't answer. She sent letters, long ones, explaining everything. Explaining how she met Marcus at a work conference, how the attention felt intoxicating after years of comfortable routine, how she convinced herself she could have both lives until she realized she was living neither. How she'd spent those 2 nights in a hotel room alone, terrified of both choices in front of her, until she finally drove to Seattle and saw Marcus standing in front of his new apartment building, and realized she didn't love him. She loved the idea of escape. I read those letters once and then put them in a drawer. Maybe someday they'll mean something. Maybe someday I'll understand how a person can throw away 8 years without even having the courage to say goodbye to your face. But that day isn't today. Sometimes people ask me if I hate her. I don't. Hate requires caring, and I've worked too hard to stop caring. What I feel is something quieter and more final. I feel free. Because here's what I learned in those 2 days when she was gone: I didn't fall apart. I didn't crumble. I survived her absence, and that meant I didn't need her presence. And once you realize you don't need someone who's already decided they don't want you, the hardest part is already over. She didn't come home for 2 nights, and I didn't wait for an excuse. I waited for 8 years. That was long enough.